Well, thank you so much for joining us on Let the Healing Begin podcast. I'm your host, Asia, and today we have AmiLynne with us. How are you doing, Amy?
I'm doing great, Asha.
That's good. So, where are you from?
Well, my husband and I, with our fur babies, live in Denver, Colorado, actually a little suburb, Centennial, and love living in the Colorado Rockies and just love being in Denver and this part of the country. It's beautiful.
Okay. So, were you born there?
I was not. I was born in Southern California. And my high school days, my dad moved us to a little town in Indiana, did my college education in Indiana, and then moved to Florida. And then many years after moving to Florida, I met my dear sweet husband 17 years ago. We took the big plunge. And since then, we've lived back in California for a number of years and then moved to the Denver area in 2016. So lots of travel, but lots of great experiences. Very grateful for all of it.
That's good. So, let's take a moment to go back to your childhood. What was that like for you growing up?
Oh, well, it was, if you'd asked me that question 15 years ago, you got a very different answer. 15 years ago, I wouldn't have talked about it with you. I had fallen victim to a victim role. And yet life has a way, if we are willing, to remind us of the lessons and the blessings in every situation. And so I grew up in a very strict household. I grew up in a household where the religious beliefs were quite radical and very, very strict and stringent and regimented. And what I've learned in the last handful of years on my own spiritual journey and my own healing journey is to be grateful for those experiences and not to throw them out, no throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because you can't have the healing if you don't acknowledge the wound.
Absolutely.
And not to vilify the person or persons or circumstances that I feel like created the wound, but to learn how to love them from a different place. And so that childhood for me, I now see, was an amazing laboratory for learning that lessons come with blessings every time, not just when things turn out the way we want, but every time, which is a great reminder as an adult that in a moment of challenge to look for the blessing too, because it's just as present as the challenge is.
Absolutely. And you know what is that's it takes some work to, be in that space where you can look at challenging situations and be like, okay, I learned some really good lessons, and just even the lessons are blessings, right? Because we grow the most in the most uncomfortable spaces of our lives. So let me ask you this. I know that you said like growing up in your household, it was really religious. Did you have any, once you came out of that, did you kind of stay like in religion, or did you, because sometimes when people grow up in religion, they kind of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, they just exit stage left and they're done. There's not room, there's not time, there's not space for God.
Yeah. Or they kind of despise it a little,
Oh yeah, absolutely. And to some degree, there was a component of that for me.
Okay.
Now, I wound up going to a Lutheran university for my undergraduate and missed out on an amazing opportunity because while I was required to take a Bible class every semester, the university I went to, Valparaiso University, has a world-renowned chapel on it. Mm-hmm. And even though we had chapel every day from 10 to 10:20, I didn't go. Yeah. I wasn't at a place in my life where I cared to pursue a relationship with God. The God that I felt like I had been introduced to was not something like, look, if I want challenges in my life, all I got to do is wake up. I don't need to go to church to find more. I don't need to feel condemned and judged and less than. And so for a number of years, while there was a curiosity, because I just knew that what I'd grown up with wasn't quite right. Mm-hmm. For me, I also didn't have the courage or a sense of knowing to trust walking into a church and feeling like it would be okay. So for a number of years, I actually kept God and religion and just the whole conversation at arm's length. And, you know, as I look back now, there was probably some bitterness and some anger. So much didn't make sense about life in comparison to what I had been taught in church. Things like I was raised with a philosophy that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, because if something's bad happening to you, that's God punishing you for a choice that you've made elsewhere.
Yeah.
And while I see some merit in the thought process, I recognize that that's not truth, and that's not what the Bible teaches, and that is man inserting his or her agenda into God's love. But when you're in the middle of that and you don't know differently, the easiest projection to blame is, well, God, like, I don't need that in my life.
Yeah.
And so as I grew and my life experience changed, I began to question. And that included those beliefs that I had grown up with, and began to recognize, folks who know me know that I'm recognizing that we have a huge component of what I called borrowed belief. And our borrowed beliefs come from people who mean well. My parents meant well. Church organization meant well. My teachers meant well. My friends meant well. That being said, well-meaning doesn't mean truth, doesn't mean proper, doesn't mean principled. And so I've been afforded the opportunity to question and reevaluate, to find what is true for me as I sought out an actual relationship with God. And the biggest transition for me in that space was recognizing that a relationship, whether it's with the divine or whether it's with a human, is never going to succeed if it's considered transactional.
Yeah.
If you do this and you do it well, then you will be rewarded with X. It's not the way God works
At all.
It's not the way God works. Matter of fact, quite the opposite, because even if I do something, whether I do it well or not, whether it's proper or not, God loves me, period.
Yeah.
God doesn't love me in spite of. God doesn't love me because of. God loves me. And so that transition from a child and a child's mind and a child's heart, that the desire is to please those around us.
Yep.
And that when you grow up in a space where questioning is not allowed because it was seen as being disrespectful.
Yep.
Learning how to question,
Yep.
learning how to find your voice, and learning that just because you found your voice doesn't mean everybody wants to hear it. That process has been such a blessing to me as each one of those lessons became more practical and impactful. I could take the foundation of what I was raised with, the structure, the framework, but I could take what was right and proper and principled for me, but I had to do the work to figure it out.
Yep.
So now my belief system, the order in which my life operates, it no longer operates on borrowed belief. It operates from a place of experience and knowing and wisdom. And that's been a great process for me.
And you know what? You said something that resonated with me very deeply. Like growing up, I was raised in a really religious setting too. And we were always taught, like, you're not supposed to question God, right? And so, like, having that in the back of my mind, knowing that I think that put a sever between, a wedge between me and God for many years. Because I was taught, like you said, questioning is disrespectful. And
who am I to question God, the creator of all?
Exactly.
Like, check yourself, little girl. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Until one day I had an aunt that told me, because I told her, I said, I have so many questions for God. And she said, well, niece, you can ask God questions. And I'm like, I had no idea. And do you not know, later on that night is when, like, I had my breakthrough with God, when I sat down to read the Bible, and he answered every single question that I had expressed earlier that day.
Yeah.
And that was the turning point. That was the starting point of me having an intentional relationship with him. I think oftentimes, and another thing that God has revealed to me is this whole religious spirit is not of him. That's a demonic spirit. And what it does is it places God in this box, right? I've interacted very closely with God, and he's not like this big mean God, where we can't talk to him and ask him questions. He wants that level of intimacy with us, So let me ask you this. So based on like how you were raised and, and the religious things and the what'd you say, the borrowed knowledge or the borrowed belief, based on like what you knew then and what you know now that you are in an intentional relationship with God, what would you say are like the top 3 misconceptions about God?
Ooh, I like that question. I like that a lot. Ooh, because that fits right into that questioning phase. One big aha for me that is life-changing, because I think so many of us, regardless of our upbringing, regardless of our church past, being present or lack thereof, a big question that so many of us sit in is, who am I? What's my identity? And depending upon the church that you grow up in, it is quite readily mentioned, if not dictated, that, well, AmiLynne, you are a sinner. You were born a sinner. You were born into sin. And I don't know about you, but just the idea of being a sinner, which is something that God turns his head from, well, that feeds into that idea that I'm not worthy and I have no value. And so for me, one of the biggest changes is it's not that sin does not exist, because sin absolutely exists. But if I go back to this idea of, who am I? And we think that our roles in life are our identity, because that's what we're taught. Well, you're a good girl. You are a good student. You are a good mother. You are a good employee. Whatever the label is, we put good in front of it to denote what is expected. But if I want to go back to my true identity, I go back to, for you and your listeners, Genesis 1:1. The first chapter of Genesis, we are told that we were created in the image and likeness of our Father, Mother, God. Well, I don't know about you, and this is kind of one of those cliche things, but God don't make crap. God doesn't make garbage.
I know that's right.
If I was created in the image and likeness of my Father, Mother, God, where does this whole sinner label come from? Well, for me, the sinner label comes from Genesis chapter 2. And Genesis chapter 2 is the beginning of the story of man trying to work out his relationship to God. The disparity between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament isn't God changing. It's man understanding his or her relationship to God differently, at a deeper level. And so this idea of Adam and Eve and original sin and being born a sinner or born into sin, I no longer ascribe to that belief pattern. It was a borrowed belief that I think oftentimes can be used to control a person. Because we are born in a place where we desire for the people around us to be pleased with us. Very different from people pleasing, but a component of it. And so there's this idea being taught that if I was born a sinner, well, I'll take that one step further. Not only was I born a sinner, but I wasn't born a chosen one. So in our church growing up, predestination, I didn't even have a snowball's chance of going to heaven because I wasn't chosen. Which puts a different perspective on just about everything, because you're not good for the sake of expressing good. You are good or behave well for the sake of impressing those around you and meeting their expectations. And God doesn't say that. God doesn't say, hey, make sure the people around you are happy. God says, look to me for your approval.
Mm-hmm.
I am the one who will judge you, whether it be today, tomorrow, or in eternity. And so one of the things that I would definitely say has shifted for me is not that sin is not present, because we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, the Bible tells us. But my idea, I no longer take that on as part of my identity. Because what I have done, the choices I have made, the happenings in my life may have formed who I am, but they are not my identity. And I believe that that is a very divine idea, that we can make missteps.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't define who we are moving forward. We can cast off the old man. We can bring in a new way of thinking. And for me, that new way of thinking is to recognize that I don't always make the right choice or the choice I wish I had made, and I can make it differently the next time, but it doesn't affect who I am in the eyes of God. Yeah. It never has, and it never will. And that takes me then to the second thing that I see very differently, because now my job isn't to save the souls of my fellow man. My job is to love my brothers, my sisters, exactly where they are, because that's where God has them.
Yeah.
It's not for me to say that someone else is making bad choices and so therefore cut them out of my life.
Yep.
That's God's job.
Yep.
You know, and there's an old adage, stress comes from doing a job that's not yours.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we're trying to do God's job, that amps that stress level up to proportions we can't even quantify.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can recognize that my job is not to save another, my job is to express the love of God at whatever way I'm able to in any given moment, because the way I'm able to do it today may be very different than it was yesterday, may be very different than it is tomorrow. Mm-hmm. But if I can show up the best I am able in that place of loving, it shifts the idea from being my brother's keeper or my sister's keeper to being my sister. And that's a more compassionate, empathetic, and loving way to approach life, especially in the challenging moments, not just the good ones. So I'd say those are probably two real big differences from the way I grew up to how I know life to be for me today.
Oh, that was good. That was really good. And you know what? That's one thing. So that's one thing that God has revealed to me too. Like, oftentimes, we want people to change at the speeds that we want them to change, right? Because like in the religious, setting, we're taught not to talk to this type of person. Don't, interact with this type of person. And God has, checked me and snatched me up out of, that thinking process, and he ran me across a message one day that said, healed people don't need a doctor. We're supposed to be, out in the trenches and out, loving on folks. And he was just speaking to me like, look at the life of Jesus, look at the life of Yeshua. He was around the tax collectors, the prostitutes, and, just loving on people. And we're supposed to be walking in those same footsteps,
Well, and to that, take that one step further, I absolutely agree, is that I think so often, and I'm just going to speak from a Christian perspective, is it's almost acceptable to take someone else's inventory. They're not living up to Christian principles.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like it's a duty, or at least that's what we're told.
Yep.
But if we go back and we look at who I consider to be the exemplar of Christian living, which would be Jesus. If I really read back to the Bible stories and I read back to the different parables and all of the different stories in the New Testament involving Jesus, not once do I recall Jesus saying, okay, Let's do your inventory before we talk about healing.
Yeah.
What's your problem? What have you been doing to come out of that? What sin did you commit in the last 5 minutes? And did you really repent, or did you just go through the motions?
Yeah.
Jesus never asked a single thing
Yeah.
of an individual who came to him for healing. He simply saw in them what God sees in them. And that's the Genesis 1:1, perfect, whole, and complete.
Mm-hmm.
And by seeing that, the power of him seeing their true essence healed whatever ailment they brought to him.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on, because the healing is not the end step.
Yep.
Jesus healed. And then he said, each and every time, go and sin no more.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't say, once a sinner, always a sinner.
Yeah.
Good luck. Do your best. I'll be back here in 6 weeks and we'll do this all again.
Yeah.
He said, go and sin no more.
Yeah.
Which then brings us back to the question of sin. And as humans, I feel like, there is an infinite amount of ways that we sin.
Mm-hmm.
So how do I then go about this idea of eradicating sin from my life? Because if there's an innumerable amount of ways that I can sin, well, I can't take each one and address it. So what I did was I came back and I spent a couple of years praying, meditating, contemplating, questioning. Well, what is sin?
Mm-hmm.
And I went through a number of different definitions, working definitions that seemed to feel good and seemed appropriate. But what I'm recognizing now, what really resonates with my soul, is that when I think about what sin is at its very foundation and core, regardless of how it's demonstrated, sin is nothing more and nothing less than the idea that I could be separated from God.
Wow.
Because if I can be separated from God, then I can do things that are not of God. Mm-hmm. I can speak unkindly to someone. I can gossip. I can take something, a paper clip from the office that doesn't belong to me, or a pen from the register that didn't belong to me. Mm-hmm. Those are actions. But the sin is believing that I could be separate from God. Mm-hmm. And well, if we really read our Bible and believe what we're taught, well, we can't be separated from God. We may think we are, we may believe we are, we may even feel it in my gut. I feel like there's this disconnect between me and God. But that would be like saying that the rays of the sun are separated from the sun.
Yeah.
And while there is an infinite amount of ways that God is expressed, he's expressed through Ashia, he's expressed through AmiLynne, he's expressed through the AT&T customer service rep that's not meeting my need and doesn't act like they do, but that's still God being expressed.
Yeah.
And if I can remember that, then when I'm on the recipient end of that AT&T rep that's not being helpful, I'm reminded to come from an approach of compassion and love and understanding, because that's my brother or that's my sister.
Yeah.
And maybe they're having a tough day, or maybe they've not been given the training. Mm-hmm. But for me to presume that I know their heart, that gives me then permission to act a fool or to act less than who I know to be as a child of God. So it brings it back into this foundational conversation. And it also says, okay, well, which sin is greater? Well, the only sin that there is believing that we can be separate from God. And that cannot be true. Because without us, God is not expressed.
Yeah.
So it shifts the way we show up. And that shifts the experience of God that others around us have simply by the way we are showing up differently.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because there are a lot of like judgmental Christians, right? And there are a lot of people that are hurt, like either by those type of people, or by the various churches, right? And so I've seen that ruin a lot of people's appetite for God. So what would you say? Let's say we have a listener who has been hurt by a Christian, and they feel, or they've been to a church and they feel judged, and so now, they are feeling like that's a reflection of who God is. What would you say to a listener like that?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is I would think about if I was talking to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that question of, is God the church? Is God the people in the church? And then I'm going to take it one step further. Have I ever acted in a way that I thought was right and proper, only down the road to come to the realization that it wasn't? And so first thing is stepping away from the emotion for just a minute, stepping away from the emotion of feeling hurt and attaching that to a person, a place, or a thing. Look, we're not saying you're not feeling hurt. The hurt is there. The wounds are there. I've lived them, still working through some of them on my own. We're not dismissing the behavior, but think about, just for a moment, was there a time when you were so certain that something was true that even from a loving place, the way you showed up for someone else imposed that thought on them? And that probably affected your relationship with them. This is no different. This is a scenario where people, I truly believe, well-intentioned, have a belief that they adhere to, and their zealousness for that, and maybe even their misunderstanding of that belief and the way they are meant to share that belief was hurtful to you. Okay, it was hurtful. Now it's time to find out what is right for you. And just as I may like a blue shirt, but that blue shirt might look awful on somebody else, the Bible tells us that God is known by many names. And so look, I'm not asking you to walk back into a church tomorrow if you feel like you have been wounded, or if you have been wounded. I don't want to diminish it by saying you feel like. Look, you've been wounded. That's your experience. I'm not saying walk into a church tomorrow. I wasn't about to. I was on a university that had a world-renowned chapel and didn't set foot inside that place except orientation and graduation. But find a place where you feel at peace. Maybe it's going for a walk. Maybe it's your backyard. Maybe it's a comfy chair with a book. Maybe it's going to the beach. Maybe it's going out in the mountains and going for a hike. It's baking or gardening or playing with children. Think about the qualities of God that you do believe in and remove the human component from it. Because the Bible says we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, which means chances are somebody made a misstep, and that misstep hurt you. But that doesn't mean it's the only way to have a relationship with God. And that because that one didn't work, or because that one hurt, that there's no other way to commune with our Father, Mother, God. So what is it? Is it baking? Is it reading? Is it listening to poetry? Is it sitting on the backyard and watching the sunset or the sunrise? Find those things, that one thing where you feel at peace and you feel a sense of even fulfillment or calm. Don't let the narrative of yesterday dictate the future of your relationship. Because if there is a need, if there's a desire to have a relationship with God, it comes up repeatedly. And it comes up sometimes in the memory of how we were hurt, or the experiences that led us to being hurt. So change the narrative in your memory. We don't dismiss, we don't condone. but we can set about making a new man, creating a new experience, and finding what is true for you. Own your own responsibility, your own accountability in your relationship with God. If 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or a year ago, you were wounded by a church experience, whether it was a doctrine or a person or an activity, heal from that. And the way to heal from that is to do it differently. But we got to find what feeds us in order to do it differently, to feel that healing.
That's good. Thank you for that. So let me ask you this, because some listeners may not understand when you say Father, Mother, God, right? Mm-hmm. Like I have an understanding of that, but some people may have never heard that. Can you like collaborate or go a little deep on that?
Sure. I grew up with a male God figurehead, and so many of us have. That being said, when you begin to really read into the Bible, God is genderless. The word he, the word she are used to help bridge a gap of understanding, in my opinion, and in my experience, because God no more loves someone of a specific gender than he does a different gender. And for the record, our human body is not our identity. He sees our soul. He sees our very essence and being. God doesn't see the material makeup that would denote us as male or female. And so this idea of who is God and what is God, for me, I did that deep dive, as you just said. And what is God? Well, God is loving. Well, loving is not a male or a female quality. God is powerful. Well, man would want you to believe that powerful is either a man or a male or a female quality. But just because man wants us to believe, that doesn't make it true. And so for me, I say Father, Mother, God, because that's the complete figurehead. That is the complete creator. That is our complete source. Because God created me, I identify as female. He created my husband. My husband identifies as male. So, and if we are but an expression of God, that means that God is both male and female. But it's not about the material, physical attributes. It's about the spiritual qualities of love, of principle, of power, of courage and boldness, of softness and gentleness and empathy. And so for me, that's why I say Father, Mother, God. And it's as much a reminder to me as it is a sharing and an example to those around me that God doesn't delineate, and neither should I.
Absolutely. So I got another question for you. Oh, it just slipped my mind. Oh, here it goes. Thank you, Father. So let's say we have a listener that feels like they want to, do it like a deeper dive with God. But, oftentimes we're taught or made to feel like, you can't come to God if you're living this type of way or if you're doing this. What would you say to a listener that is scared to approach God or, to approach the throne of grace because they feel like, oh, I've done something way too wrong, or the lifestyle that I'm living doesn't match what what religion has taught me? What would you say to that listener?
Well, I would say that if it is on your heart to come closer to God, God is already speaking to you. And that anything else that comes to mind, any excuse, any reason, any justification that would come to you is simply mortal mind. It's error, it's distraction, and it's noise. Some would refer to that as the devil. But what I say is it's distraction. It's the ego still needing to exist in this human experience that says, well, you know what? God is all that, And until you got your stuff together, you don't want to go. But what the Bible says is gather up that stuff and come and lay it at my feet. Bring it to the altar. And I'm not talking physical feet or a tangible altar. I'm simply talking about the ability to say, okay, God, it's just you and me. I am terrified to have this conversation with you right now because of all the things people have said to me about you. And I don't know what I believe in this moment. But you keep coming to thought. And that is enough. We don't have to ask a question of God. We don't have to have an answer. But what we get to do is we get to recognize that if we keep hearing that calling to explore our relationship with God, then God is speaking to you. And the rest of this is just distraction. It's just noise. And it can be really loud and it can be very imposing. And so that for me is when it's really good to look for what I call a travel partner.
Oh, that was good.
Travel partner in there to give you answers.
Yeah.
Travel partner isn't there to do the work for you.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not anything in this life that isn't easier if we've got someone sitting beside us, encouraging us, hearing us exactly where we're at, seeing us for exactly who we are, not casting judgment, not telling us that we need to be fixed because we're not broken. So that to me is that space of it's noise and it's really loud. But find a travel partner that you can sit with in silence as you go to God. Or a travel partner that you can say, look, I don't think God wants to hear from me right now. And that person doesn't say, yeah, you're right. You've messed up in so many ways. But that person instead says, well, let's talk about it. And asks the question, hey, I'm a heathen. God doesn't love me. Well, the Bible tells me that's not true. So what about that statement? For me, if someone were to say that to me, I'm a sinner. Well, what makes you believe that? Well, because everybody's told me that. What does the Bible tell you? What does God tell you in your heart of hearts when you lay your head down at night? The God I know, the God you know, isn't taking our inventory at the end of each day. The God I know is grateful that when we lay our head down on our pillow, that we will wake up the next morning. And we will try again. And we're going to miss the mark because that's part of being human. But don't let someone else's opinion of who and what God is keep you from exploring a genuine relationship with God. It's just like in high school when we had, girlfriends and boyfriends. And the minute you break up with him or he breaks up with you, your friends have all kinds of comments about that other person. And so many of them aren't very good. Oh, well, I knew you two would never make it because he does this or she did that. Or no, that's not what our relationship with God is about. Our relationship with God is about seeing what our relationship to God is. And just because someone else says something about God, even if multitudes of people say that, it doesn't make it true. Our job, our process, what we get to do is to find out what that relationship to God is for ourselves. And then we'll realize that things can be very different for us. And the more we work at that, the quieter those voices get. They're still there. They're still saying the same thing. But when we don't put value in them, they don't have value in our life. And so therefore, it doesn't affect how we our relationship with God because we see it for what it is. It may be true for them, but something that's true for you does not make it truth for me.
That's good. So I got a couple more questions for you. So what are, okay, so I can hear the father speaking to me about exposing the enemy, right? Because a lot of times you'll catch a lot of people who can't decipher the voice of God from the enemy, right? Because sometimes the enemy, he will try to disguise himself as the father, you know. So what are some of the, I would say, let's say, what are the top 3 tactics that you would say, you know, of the enemy? Or I'm not even gonna say the top 3, but what are the, you know, what are 3 that you've noticed that, you know, Satan uses a lot on folks?
I think this is a fantastic question. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remind myself, and in doing so, share this idea with your listeners, is who is Satan? Satan in the Bible is a fallen angel. A fallen angel. And so to dismiss entirely a fallen angel is to dismiss a child of God. And you nor I ever feel very good when someone dismisses us. So it's not about vilifying, it's not about canceling, it's not about dismissing. It's about learning to discern. But in order to discern the voice of God versus a false prophet, and I'm going to use the idea of a false prophet versus the devil, because we've just talked about the devil. He's just a fallen angel. It may be someone whose skill level in their relationship with God isn't very good yet, or they're stuck at a skill level and they've kind of set up shop there and they're not continuing to grow. So let's not cast judgment in a place where we're trying to remove judgment from our experience, but let's let that voice of God versus a false prophet. How do we discern the difference between the two? An exercise that I will do oftentimes, and I started with myself, but I'll often do this with clients, is I will say, I want you to just close your eyes. Now, if you're driving and listening to this, please do not close your eyes. But if you're in a place while you're listening to this podcast episode, I want you to just take a deep breath and I want you to close your eyes and walk through this with me for just a moment. And I want you to think of a person that you know beyond a shadow of a doubt loves you unconditionally. And I want you to think about what that feels like when they embrace you, whether it's in a phone conversation or a hug in that presence. Now hold on to that muscle memory for just a moment of that person that you know unequivocally loves you. Now I want you to go over and I want you to think about someone that you know is in your life for their own gain. They've got an agenda. And I want you to think about when they say, I love you, what does that feel like? What do we acknowledge in our thought and in our heart? Physically, what are we feeling when that person says, I love you, or speaks something as if it were truth? We know the difference. We have to get the other voices out of the way to feel the difference. And so that's what I would say. First, remove the idea of the devil, of someone coming in purposefully conspiring against you. Because even a false prophet isn't purposefully conspiring against you. I truly believe that they believe what they're sharing. Their skill level, though, in their relationship with God is maybe at a stuck point, or maybe at a point different than where you're at. But think about that moment of truth. Am I hearing the voice of God? Well, if it's a false prophet, does it make me feel good physically, or does it make me feel good spiritually? And feeling good isn't about removing challenge. Feeling good is about knowing that there's truth behind that statement. Because things are going to be hard. The Bible never promised us, God never promised us life would be easy. God promised us we would never do it alone. And so it takes work to discern the difference between the voice of God and a false prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And we work at that every day, even questioning or journaling or praying and saying, look, God, I know that this person, their intention was genuine, but is what they're saying to me true?
Mm-hmm.
Our job is to stop outsourcing belief and to do the work, because God is there to do the work with us. And God is there to guide us. But it's so much easier to just take what somebody else says as gospel, pun intended, if you will.
Yep.
When we stop outsourcing belief because someone has this accolade or those accreditations behind their name, and we really listen, we know the difference between the voice of God and what may be a false prophet, distracting. And it's not about removing the false voices, the false prophets. It's about tuning in to the voice of God. Because that other stuff ain't never going to go away. It's 2024, and all we got to do is turn on the news, turn on the television, whether it's a news program, an entertainment piece, a comedy piece. Those false prophets, those voices are there, ready to go on full blast. But the Bible says in Psalms, peace, be still, and know that I am God. It's the small voice of God, but we have to learn to listen for it. And this whole idea that I don't know if I'm hearing the voice of God, that is a false prophet. That is a false belief. We know in our heart of hearts the voice of God. And if you need a little help discerning it, remember that travel partner we talked about a few moments ago?
Yep.
Have a conversation, talk about it. Don't dismiss the voice of God because the other voices are too loud.
Mm-hmm.
But invite that voice of God to be louder in your experience, so that when these other out of control voices are overwhelmingly loud, it doesn't mean that what is the phrase? The presence of darkness does not indicate the absence of light.
Mm-hmm.
The voice of the voice of human reasoning, the voice of human control, does not mean there's an absence of divine idea. It just means we get to learn to listen differently.
That's good. That's real good.
And always easier to do with a travel partner that's not here, that's going to tell you, well, that was the voice of God, you should know. Mm-hmm. But a travel partner is going to listen. And the more you talk, the more God is speaking and helping you work through that question.
Absolutely.
Find a good travel partner.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I got 2 more questions for you. So what is it that you do now? What do you do, like, as far as like work? And I know that you're here on the podcast with us. Do you have any books? Do you offer any services?
I do. I've had to work really hard at what I call myself, because I started out in the corporate world, which so many of us do that move into this healing space. And I consider myself, matter of fact, the label I have given myself that I work to live up to every day is Chief Travel Partner.
Okay. I like that.
And I am the creator of the Life Charter program. And that Life Charter program tugs 12 dimensions of our life, everything from intellectual life to parenting to love relationships, my spiritual life, my career, my money life, all 12 of those dimensions in our life. And we talk about what is the belief that we have? What's our premise? What is our vision? What is our purpose? And what is our strategy? to creating the life that God has called us to live. And by putting together this life charter, what we do is we create a space where no matter what is showing up in our life, we have a foundation that we have created that helps us answer those questions. That when an opportunity shows up, we're able to easily discern, is that for me or not? It may be a great idea, but it doesn't mean it's for me. Mm-hmm. And so I work in that coaching space, that spiritual direction space. And whether it is looking for more of that spiritual connection in your life, because I believe we are spiritual beings having a human experience, mm-hmm. or whether it is healing from past religious experiences, well-intentioned or not, they still cause wounds. And if we don't heal those wounds, then it makes it more challenging to hear the voice of God. Mm-hmm. So for me, being that travel partner for people, helping them find God in their life has been such a rewarding space in my own healing. Mm-hmm. So I've got some courses, I've got I've got a prayer practice called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Pray. Oh, and it's all about the power of affirmative prayer. Because we talk about God as being all knowing, right? Yeah. And then we go to God with our petition of all the things we want God to fix in our life. Well, no, that's not the relationship I want to have with my Father, Mother, God.
Yeah.
And so that prayer of the affirmation reminds me what I know to be true about God, reminds me to look for God, and opens up my relationship with God.
Yep.
So we've got all of that. I do have a new book out, June 1st, Conversations of Consequence, Lessons from the Still Small Voice. And that it takes us on a journey. Each chapter begins with a story that feels very almost mystical in its placing. But then as the story evolves, you see that it's very practical people and very practical today experiences in 2024 that we're talking about. Each chapter has soul challenges, because a book about spirituality shouldn't be a how-to. Mm-hmm. It should answer the question, that's great, AmiLynne, but how do I?
Yeah.
And so that book is out. You can get it on Amazon. And you can find me quite easily. I'm sure the show notes are going to have my name spelled properly, and everything is my name. My website, AmiLynne Carroll. My Instagram handles, my Facebook handles are both AmiLynne Carroll. You're looking for a travel partner? That's what I have been put on this planet to do. It's to love you where you're at, to hear you where you are, to see the beauty of the mess that you might feel like your life is. I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to sitting with you and honoring where you are, because it's by honoring where we are that we are able to actually move forward to where God is calling us to be.
Absolutely. I really appreciate this.
It's been great to be here. I look forward to working with you beyond this as well. What a great podcast, and what a great service and offering you and your other guests and your audience, bring. There's a reason you keep showing up for them, and that's because they show up for you. Mm-hmm. And I'm grateful to you that you continue to show up. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. And thank you all to everyone who's tuned in to enjoy this segment. A couple things before we shut this down. If you're looking for additional ways to support the show, you can head on over to Amazon and purchase a copy of Back in My Day by Ashia Wilson. You can also head over to greatergrowthllc.com and purchase a t-shirt or sweatshirt. Thank you so much, and until next time.